this is all visible in the right way. So, welcome to the lecture Compassion as a Universal Way of Living, which is the last lecture in the series H.P. Blavatsky's role in transforming the world mentality, which eventually became a double series because there was so much to say about this topic that we couldn't cover it within 1 month. So in these 2 months, we presented the lecture in pairs of 2, the first of which concerned theosophical teachings and principles. We talked about the spiritual heart of every being, universal brotherhood, freedom of thought and conscience, followed by a second lecture with examples of all the social changes that took place based on those principles, like the abolition of slavery, racism, decolonization, up to the many peace activities, and last week the groundbreaking changes that occurred in science around 1900. And then we take a closer look at what all these changes have in common. And when we take a closer look at what all these changes have in common, we see that there is one principle running through as a golden thread, and that is compassion. Now, compassion as the driving force behind all these societal changes is clearly visible. And that is why we conclude this series by trying to get a deeper understanding of what compassion exactly entails and what it means to have compassion as a way of living. Blavatsky, of course, has said a great deal about it, of which it is always good to emphasize that this was not her personal vision, but the timeless wisdom she gave to humanity as the messenger of the Lord's wisdom and compassion. Stripped off all dogmatism and degeneration, as in fact every impulse from that great lodge is a purification of the same universal wisdom. The great challenge, however, that Blavatsky faced in her time was to convey the profound and ethical depth of the concept of compassion to a society that was not yet of this quality. First, she had to attune her message to the level of the prevailing mentality in order to get the intention and from there take people along to a deeper understanding. Earlier in this series, we already described this mentality by quoting a letter from one of Blavatsky's teachers in which the Mahachohan, the teacher of Blavatsky's teachers, speaks about 2 dominating views at the time. On the one hand, of the dogmatic church, based on blind faith, and on the other hand, a strongly materialistic science prevailing at that time, denying any existence of an inner or higher life. Why is this so important? Because when we talk about compassion, both views of degrading superstition and still more degrading brutal materialism, as it is expressed in the Mahachohan letter, both of these completely undermine the idea of compassion. A blind faith paralyzes independent thought, conscience, and a sense of responsibility, and it leads to a behavior of superiority and the oppression of other nations. And a materialistic science denies any form of ensouled life or the unity and interconnectedness of life, and leads to a worldview governed by chance and the idea of the survival of the fittest. In the letter referred to as the curse known as the struggle for life, which is the real and prime cause of suffering, misery, and all crimes. So both dominant worldviews completely lack the foundation for ethics. And in the midst of this, Blavatsky had the immense task of bringing the message of universal brotherhood and compassion. And the way she did this was therefore not just randomly, but based on a preconceived plan by her teachers. To first make the connection with the people, as mentioned, in order to gradually build up a deeper understanding. And she did this in roughly 4 phases, corresponding to the 4 life phases of the organization that Johanna Vermeulen earlier talked about in her series H.P. Blavatsky's mission in the hierarchy of compassion. Starting with the first phase in 1877 with the publishing of Blavatsky's first major work, I.S.I.S. Unveiled, in which her task was to first create space in Western thought. To break the molds of mind, as she herself said, refuting all misconceptions and degenerated ideas in order to make room for the right understanding instead. The book consisted of two parts, science and theology, so exactly the two disciplines just mentioned in the letter as the two great causes of suffering once they fall into materialism and dogmatism. And it is exactly this degeneration which she heavily combats in that book. And while she breaks down all the degenerate ideas of the various exoteric traditions, she simultaneously shows the common source, the pure esoteric foundation of all those traditions, when you look through the outer form. And by doing so, she introduces two initial thoughts that are crucial regarding compassion. First, that the divine is not outside but within us, giving back to man the responsibility for his own actions, but moreover the idea of fundamental equality, since all life shares the same divine essence. And secondly, with regard to materialistic science, she showed that behind the material world there is a much more real and causal world. That there is no such thing as dead matter, but everything we can perceive with our senses is the physical expression of an inner life. So two fundamental thoughts as a start to be able to form a real understanding of compassion. In the next phase, Blavatsky gives much more depth to these thoughts with the publication of The Secret Doctrine in 1888. This work makes Blavatsky's impulse truly unique, because it provides a fully ethical and logic-based philosophical foundation for compassion. Not simply a rule of conduct, like the golden rule you find in all traditions, but a comprehensive system of teachings that can also be individually tested. And this philosophical foundation is actually presented in its entirety in the three fundamental propositions of the Secret Doctrine. Three principles that provide very concisely the complete foundation for compassion. They show the fundamental unity of life, since all life is rooted in the same boundless essence, which therefore is also the same essence of every being, which was also the subject of our lecture of April 14th, the spiritual heart of every being. And because that spiritual heart is the same in every being, there is also an essential equality and interconnectedness, which was the topic of April 26 on universal brotherhood, in which we showed that universal brotherhood is not a human invention or sentiment, but a fact based on the laws of the universe. Now, both volumes of the Secret Doctrine are in fact just a further elaboration of these principles. All the teachings that come along, such as karma, reincarnation, the hierarchical structure of the universe, involution and evolution, they may seem technical at first, but are in fact nothing but the fundament for compassion. Because together they show the total picture of how life is interdependent in all its interconnectedness. Then the next phase starts in the Theosophical Society, in which a mere philosophical understanding of compassion was no longer enough, because putting it into practice was now required. For the organization had come to the point where a group of members was needed to be gathered to ensure the future of the Theosophical Society in the world. A nucleus to represent the soul of the organization as a link between the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion and the outer world. In this time, a series of articles appeared in the Lucifer magazine, announcing the start of this group, named the Esoteric School, in which it was explained what criteria one had to meet in order to join. Because this nucleus, understandingly, had to be of a certain quality in order to function as a link. And that quality was fully determined by the extent to which a person was willing to give up his own ambitions and development for that of humanity. In other words, compassion as merely a philosophical concept was no longer sufficient, but now an absolute requirement was to become the living example of it. Finally, in the fourth phase, the most esoteric and profound teachings of compassion were given with the publication of the booklet The Voice of the Silence. As instructions for the disciple on the path, dedicated to the few, so among others, those who were accepted to join the esoteric school because they had proved themselves worthy. It is a booklet unparalleled in its esoteric depth for the Western world, consisting of precepts for the disciple on the path, so those who are willing to give their life for the alleviation of suffering in the world, willing to sacrifice all personal advancement for the benefit of the totality, and thus truly being a living expression of compassion. But, and this is a crucial thought to end this introduction, although for the outside world the understanding of compassion had to be built up step by step, from within the organization, from the very foundation in 1875, compassion has been the sole reason for its existence. And this becomes very clear in the following quote from the Mahachohan, the letter that we cited before. He said, and I quote, "Rather perish the Theosophical Society with both its hapless founders, than that we should permit it to become no better than an academy of magic and a hall of occultism." End of quote. In other words, if compassion is no longer the central motive of the members of the organization, it will be the end of it, as far as the external side concerned. For the inner side of the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion, as we have shown in the previous series, has always been and will always continue to be active. Okay, let's have a closer look at what we exactly understand by compassion. And getting straight to the core, based on the three fundamental principles of the secret doctrine, that all life is inseparable, fundamentally equal, and one in essence, we can describe compassion as a sense of oneness, identifying with all life, and therefore living the life in service of the totality. The first important consequence of this description is that compassion is universal. To be one with all that lives means that compassion doesn't entail any preference. Because as soon as you would prefer one for the other, it would simply contradict this idea of unity and equality. And if you consider this for a moment, it has far-reaching consequences. For it means that you are not only willing to help your friends, but also people you don't know at all, or even your so-called enemies. It also means that you do not limit yourself to a certain group, because compassion transcends group interest. No matter how large the group is, whether it is your family, a city, a country, but even choosing for humanity as a group, as a kingdom of nature, implies an exclusion of the other kingdoms on the planet. So compassion has no exceptions or preferences, because following the universal law of unity, by definition it relates to the whole, unconditionally. Of course, that is quite something to state that compassion has no limits. Because why then do we not see boundless compassion around us, you may ask? But that has everything to do with the fact that the awareness of this oneness is different for everyone. From people in whom this awareness is still completely dormant, resulting in total selfishness, all the way up to the great world teachers who experience their oneness with each and every living being and act accordingly. And because of this, we see a vast range in the expressing of compassion, which might lead one to think that compassion is a relative concept. But that is not the case. And for this, it is important to make a clear discernment between the following. Namely, that the principle of compassion doesn't change. The intention to work for the totality from a sense of unity to the best of one's ability. And this principle of intention is always the same. But it is the awareness of the unity that is relative, because it differs for each one of us. And therefore also the expression of compassion varies in practice. But there's another important element, that when absent you cannot speak of compassion despite experiencing the unity of life as truth. And that is the inner urge, the intrinsic desire to eliminate suffering. For it is quite possible to be aware of this exalted state of oneness, and only to strive for it, without having further genuine concern for all other life. And this may seem a subtle difference, but it is extremely fundamental. For even more than the sense of unity, compassion entails the intense desire to actively support all life that constitutes it. This is why Dr. de Brucker, one of the Theosophical teachers, speaks of compassion as a state of, and I quote, intimate magnetic sympathy with all that is, end of quote, which expresses itself in the impersonal desire, an unconditional love, to devote oneself to the totality, to do everything in your power to support life, and to eliminate the suffering that is happening around us. So if we then conclude with a definition of compassion that we also presented in the January series, we can define it as thinking and acting from a sense of unity, from universal, impersonal love, wisdom, and knowledge about the laws of nature. And in this definition we can recognize three aspects of compassion, two of which we have just discussed. First, the sense of unity, the interconnectedness of all life. Second, the universal impersonal love that follows from this, the intimate magnetic sympathy, and the desire to alleviate suffering unconditionally, because compassion knows no exception. But thirdly, wisdom and knowledge about the laws of nature. And this is the next subject we want to discuss, the relation between wisdom and compassion. Because it is not without reason that the Great Lodge, of which Blavatsky is the messenger, is called the Lodge of Wisdom and Compassion. For these two concepts are inseparable, and this connectedness presents itself in two ways. The first we already mentioned and has everything to do with perceiving unity. The ability to see the unity through or behind the multiplicity of physical forms. And by perceiving this greater reality of unity, seeing through the illusion of separateness, another word also used for wisdom is discernment, because it is exactly this ability to be able to discern between the true and lasting, the inner essence of life, immortal and one on the one hand, and its temporary external form which is transient on the other hand. And so if we have just defined compassion as living for the totality from a sense of unity, you see that wisdom, this inner understanding of oneness, is directly related to compassion. In this regard, it is interesting to look at the original Sanskrit word for wisdom, which is buddhi or bodhi, from the Sanskrit root bud, often translated as enlightened. But rather than enlightened, a better translation actually is awakened, because it concerns an inner state of consciousness, mostly dormant in us now, but once we have activated this inner faculty, we are, so to speak, awakened in that state. And in the occult glossary of Dr. de Brucker, we find the following description. It is the state when man has so emptied his mind that it is filled only with the self itself, with the selfless selfhood of the eternal. Then he realizes the ineffable visions of reality, of pure truth. End of quote. So this clearly shows that compassion, being fully related to this ability, is therefore not just a nice ideal or wish invented by the people, but a state of consciousness based on reality. And whether dormant or not, everyone fundamentally has this state of consciousness latent within. But there's a second aspect to this connection between wisdom and compassion. And that concerns the practical application. Because if you want to be a helping force as best as you can, it is of course important to know how to be one. And to illustrate this with a simple example, if you buy a new device and you start using it without a manual, you may eventually figure out how it works, but A, it takes longer, and B, probably after you have made a number of mistakes. Mistakes that you may have to correct and that you could have prevented if you had first read the manual. And that is where the second aspect of wisdom comes in. The insight, the understanding what action is needed in which situation. How to eliminate the cause of the problem. It was also the longing for this insight, aroused by compassion, that made the Buddha, as Prince Siddhartha, as he still was, leave his palace with the vow not to return until he had found the truth about the cause of suffering. Until he had acquired the insight in the cause of suffering and how to eliminate it. And this word insight can be taken literally as seeing the inner cause behind the outer circumstances. Seeing with our inner eye what needs to be done to remove the cause of suffering. So where on the one hand wisdom stimulates compassion in the ability to see the unity and interconnectedness of life, the all-encompassing vision of a larger reality, on the other side it concerns the very individual level, the ability of understanding the other, what the inner cause of one's sufferings is, and what a person really needs in order to overcome his own challenges. In other words, being able to connect with others at the level they are at. And that is essential when talking about compassion, because if we are not able to connect, wisdom just remains empty knowledge without use to anyone. Or as Blavatsky says, and I quote, "Therefore, the double activity of learning and doing is most necessary. We have to do good, and we have to do it rightly, with knowledge." End of quote. But then, of course, the inevitable question rises, if the two concepts are so inextricably connected, Is it then possible to be compassionate without wisdom? And that's an important question, because you sometimes hear people say that you first have to work on yourself, that you first have to become wise yourself before you can help others. But Blavatsky is very clear about the fallacy of this claim, and that the opposite is even the case. Because the interaction of wisdom and compassion also means that there is no faster way to become wiser than by helping others. And this brings us back to the essence of compassion. That the intention is all determining. The motive of wanting to help others without seeking any benefit for oneself. So if the so-called manual is missing, but help is urgently needed somewhere, you can sit and wait for a manual, but you can also immediately come to the rescue to the best of your ability. And when you do the latter, and do this from the right motive, the sincere desire to help the other, then you are guaranteed to develop the necessary wisdom most quickly. Blavatsky says the following about this the moment someone asks her how you can develop intuition best. She gives the following answer. And I quote, "First of all, by giving it exercise. And second, by not using it for personal ends." Exercise means that it must be followed through mistakes and bruises until, from sincere attempts at use, it comes to its own strength. This does not mean that we can do wrong and leave the results, but that after establishing conscience on a right basis, by following the golden rule, we give play to the intuition and add to its strength. Inevitably, in this, at first we will make errors, but soon, if we are sincere, it will grow brighter and make no mistake. End of quote. That's also why we find in the Voice of the Silence that self-knowledge is the child of loving deeds, where self is written with a capital because it concerns the universal self, the universal essence of all life that we gain more insight into when we act out of compassion. And another of her quotes is that philosophy is not only love for wisdom, but also the wisdom of love. Exactly the same idea that love, and that's not personal love for someone or something in particular, but the unconditional love for all life leads to deeper insight into the essence of it. So to sum up, you could say that wisdom and compassion reinforce one another as two aspects of the same thing, but compassion always as the leading motive. And actually, this all comes together perfectly in the term bodhisattva, a Sanskrit word of which the literal translation is he whose being has become wisdom. And often a bodhisattva is described as a being who is just one step away from Buddhahood, in attaining nirvana. But a more esoteric teaching is that a bodhisattva consciously renounces his state of spiritual bliss in order to still be able to alleviate suffering on earth. Because although the bodhisattva has this unveiled vision of oneness and has totally risen himself beyond the illusion of the physical world, he is fully aware that this material world is a reality for suffering humanity, still identifying with it. And it is for this very realization, this inner wisdom, guided by compassion, that makes a bodhisattva decide not to disappear into the state of nirvana, but to refuse it to be a helping force in this world. Next, I would like to have a look at what compassion is not. Because having clarity about what something is not also helps in getting a clearer picture of what it is. and is also an opportunity to correct a number of misunderstandings that surround compassion. But we cannot do that properly without first having a clear picture of what we are as human beings. And also in this, Blavatsky has made an invaluable contribution by reintroducing the knowledge of the composite nature of man. She did this in different ways, which don't really differ from each other principally, but only in level of detail. And for now, I'll just highlight the more detailed ones, because in the end, it is simple twofold. It is the simple twofold division that is actually the most useful to explain the misunderstandings around compassion. In doing so, we always start with what we essentially are as human beings. A stream of consciousness, infinite in essence, rooted in the boundless. And in this stream we can recognize 7 levels or states of consciousness within ourselves, from the most universal to the most limited. From Atman, the universal self, our sense of oneness with the entire universe, to the most limited range of the Sthula Sarira, which is our physical body. And of course everything in between, emotions, desires, visions, ideals, that we in our entirety are as a bundle of forces and characteristics. And now you also see Buddhi located right below Atman, because it is our inner wisdom, which allows us to see the unity and inner heart of all life. The 7-fold division can be simplified to a 3-fold division with an imperishable or spiritual part, a learning part, and a transient part, or the body, of which the learning part is our human consciousness, our soul or mind by which we express ourselves. But then there's another division that Blavatsky uses, which is the most simplified duality, that of the inner and the outer man, in which the inner identifies with the imperishable, our immortal reincarnating part, realizing our unity with all life, being selfless and compassionate. And the outer man who identifies with the transient, the physical world, which causes it to feel separated from others, constantly placing itself at the center of all its thoughts, emotions, and desires. Blavatsky gives to those two selves in us the terms actor and role. The actor is who we are in essence, and the role is the temporary part we play as actor. So the actor being the immortal inner man, playing a new role each life, and just as the actor uses a temporary costume in a play, the inner man uses its personality as the temporary instrument for this one life only. And despite the fact that we are the actor, merely playing a role, we can still fully identify ourselves with this role. And we do this each time we say I to our personal emotions, to our desires and impulses in which we put ourselves central. But if we, on the other hand, identify with the actor, we say I to our conscience, to our inner wisdom, accumulated over lives, to our sense of unity, to interconnectedness, making us to be forgiving, loving, and selfless. And also without judgment, due to the ability to see the inner real potential behind the outer limitations. And it is therefore in this self of the actor within to which compassion belongs as a state of consciousness. So when we look at the misunderstandings surrounding compassion, this twofold division is essential to keep in mind. Because when we talk about compassion regarding ourselves, the key question is always, which self? Which self are we talking about? The actor we are, or the role that we play? Okay, the first misconception, that compassion does not equal pity. Although when having pity you empathize with the other person, it stays limited to the emotional plane only. You project your own feelings onto the other person's situation, which makes you, in reality, suffer with the other. Using Blavatsky's metaphor, you could say that in playing your role, you empathize with the other person's role, identifying with it, which limits you at that same level. Because really, compassion transcends the emotional level. Because while you of course empathize with the other, being fully aware of his suffering, at the same time you know that the other is more than the suffering personality. Because you are able to see the actor, the inner man behind the role, behind the suffering personality. And it is this part you make contact with, from actor to actor, so to speak. So in case of compassion, you don't lose yourself in emotions, but you stay composed and calm, focusing on the inner part of the other that is able to face his own suffering. That part in which also the ability and strength are present to overcome the suffering himself. And that is what you appeal to. Compassion therefore also means that you don't see the other person as a victim, but as someone who is capable of regaining himself. And of course you also give emotional support, but you don't linger in emotions because the real support is surpassing that level. And by transcending the emotional, you help the other to see the cause of the suffering with the inner eye so he can remove this cause himself. And it also means that compassion is not equal to being nice all the time. It's another misconception concerning compassion. Because enabling someone to grow inwardly, to overcome his own karmic challenges, can sometimes appear to be harsh. Just as for a child it may feel harsh when it is set boundaries, while in fact this is for his own good, enabling it to acquire self-control and selflessness. And in similar way, compassion is not so much aimed at pleasing the outer man, but rather at helping the inner man to master his own personality. Blavatsky says in this context that an adept, the sage, by his great intuitive ability, knows whom to relieve from pain by kindness and whom to leave in the mire, because at that moment it is his best teacher. And that kindness and gentle treatment in certain cases can actually even bring out the worst qualities in someone. So while not giving in to the desire of the personality may seem unkind, actually the exact opposite is true. Because in fact there is no greater help possible than to support the inner man with insight to overcome his challenges himself. In other words, giving the actor the opportunity to take back control his role himself. The third misunderstanding is that compassion means being a softie, allowing everyone to walk over you. But here again the opposite is true. Because to stand up for others, always and everywhere, without exception, regardless of the consequences for yourself, actually requires enormous inner strength and resilience. To stand up for justice, for those who are oppressed, requires absolute courage. Just think of all the journalists who are currently risking their lives in war zones to expose the truth and injustice to the world. Or the aid workers and medics who are risking their own lives to save the lives of others. But if you would ask these people themselves, they often do not consider themselves courageous at all, because to them the choices they make are self-evident. In fact, they often say they couldn't act otherwise, because their sense of justice and compassion is so powerful that it is stronger than their fear. And that again shows that compassion, as a state of consciousness of the inner man, enables one to forget himself, to transcend his role and overcome personal fears. Then the last misconception I want to mention is perhaps the most difficult to counter, because you hear it so often in society, and that is the idea of self-compassion. The idea that you have to love yourself first, to have compassion for yourself first, before you can have it for others. But again, the exact opposite is true, and I will try to explain why. First of all, the concept of self-compassion is a contradiction in itself. For if compassion originates in the idea of oneness, thinking and acting for the totality from the sense of oneness, it means by definition that it concerns the totality, a focus on the world around you and not on yourself. And of course you are just as much a part of the whole, but to state that you must choose for yourself first is thinking in separateness. And in this regard, self-compassion is actually a philosophical incongruity. But this may be a rather theoretical answer, so let's see where this idea of self-compassion comes from. And then the metaphor of the actor and the role we play comes at hand again. Because the key to the issue of self-compassion is again, which self? Do we mean the actor or the role we play? And if we then look at how the idea of self-compassion comes about, we see that it is the personality that says I to the role it plays, continuously judging itself in that role, criticizing itself, rating itself inadequate, often in relation to social expectations, and afraid of not meeting those expectations. And therefore the personality continuously puts pressure on itself to perform, to meet a so-called perfect image. And doing a study, having a perfect job, your own house, showing your perfect life on social media, etc. And as a counter-reaction of the personality to this self-imposed pressure, this self-judgment of not being good enough, the idea of self-compassion arises. But what happens when instead of condemning yourself, you start having so-called compassion for yourself? Then that very same personality remains central. Then you keep saying I to this illusory role we play. And by doing so, you actually sustain the so-called condemner in yourself. But instead of sustaining it, you should actually give it no attention at all. Because both negative and positive attention only reinforce the personality. So do not judge yourself, but also do not pat yourself on the shoulder or pity yourself either, but just forget yourself. And there's no better way to do this than changing your attention from a focus on yourself to a focus on the world around you. By looking instead how to be meaningful and what you can do for others. Because the moment you put your self-interest aside for that of others, the personality makes way for the inner actor to take the lead, without judgment and with unconditional love, including yourself, of course, as part of the oneness. And automatically, that condemning and judgmental voice of the personality will disappear. That is why in Theosophical literature you find the paradox that you must first, and I quote, forget yourself in order to find yourself. End of quote. And then find yourself with a capital S. And another quote from the Mahachohan letter that, and I quote, all of us have to get rid of our own ego, the illusory apparent self, to recognize our true self in a transcendental divine life. End of quote. The difficulty, however, is that for the personality to forget itself gives the idea of sacrifice, of losing something, or having to give something up. But that is only because, from the limited perspective of the role we play, we cannot envision the magnificent wisdom, the all-pervading love and understanding that will come in its place. And therefore I want to show you the following quote from the Perrucker's Golden Precepts, where he shows us this vision, with such power and beauty, because he speaks from his own experience. He writes, "Sweet are the fruits of self-forgetfulness, the complete oblivion of your personality in something so beautiful and impersonal that human tongue cannot describe it. For self-forgetfulness, compassion, and peace are the fruits of the cosmic harmony, which is the very heart of the universe. When you begin to realize this fact, then, within your soul, there begins the growth of something which is indescribable, which cannot be expressed in words, but which is at once light and life and peace and wisdom and almighty love, impersonal, universal, so that everything that is, everywhere, has a fascination for you love it. In other words, instead of giving up or losing something, we actually become more ourselves, with a capital S. Because the moment we expand our consciousness from our limited self to the universal self, correspondingly, the universal part becomes active in us. The more you focus on yourself, the more your consciousness narrows and contracts, which prevents you from experiencing universal life. And just as curtains darken a room, selfishness obscures our consciousness. And just as light can shine into the room when we open the curtains, selflessness allows the inner light to shine through into ourselves. Selflessness dissolves the veils of personality, allowing the spiritual influence of our divine nature to enter, making us more human. Because our human evolution is a spiritual evolution of consciousness, of the awakening of our inner faculties, our divine nature, which expresses itself in all such characteristics as understanding, wisdom, sense of oneness, and unconditional love for all life. Therefore, developing compassion is not just a choice, but the only way to become fully human, on our way to Buddhahood. And in fact, as long as we do not think and act compassionately, we are acting against the natural course of evolution, against progress. And intuitively, we all know this. Everyone knows the feeling of wanting to be meaningful and to have a useful contribution in life. And all the well-known crises that can occur at different times in life, such as midlife crisis, 30s dilemma, quarter-life crisis, they all have one thing in common. That is, that they are existential crises about being meaningful, about the purpose of the role we play as actors in this life. Because despite the nice jobs, perhaps a house, a family, we experience an inner emptiness, arising from the realization that there must be more to it in life. And the ultimate answer to all these crises is compassion, devoting yourself to a greater purpose than just yourself, bringing your talents and qualities to the service of the greater whole of which you are an inseparable part. And this brings us finally to the practice of compassion as a way of living, which first and foremost starts with simply applying it, putting it into practice. To feel compassion without an adequate practical result ensuing from it is not to show oneself an altruist, but the reverse, Blavatsky says. It's all about what you do and not just what you think. And that's why we find the phrase in the voice of the silence that thou cannot travel on the path before thou hast become that path itself. where you have to be the living example yourself, as in fact holds true for everything. Because you can learn, for example, everything about bicycles, all the different parts, how it works, etc. But as long as you haven't stepped on a bicycle yourself, you're not able to ride one and you're simply not a cyclist. And this is no different for compassion. You have to apply it, you have to live it, to be it. But just as you start cycling on a tricycle first, compassion is something that develops step by step. And in one of her articles, Blavatsky describes the process of this growing realization of compassion within us. And she does so by means of the various stages of the awakening of our inner God, which actually comes down to exact the same thing as the growing awareness of compassion. In this article, she explains that humanity is at the tipping point, having developed the subtleties of his animal nature to their limit, to now come in contact with the divine. So, in other words, identifying ourselves more and more with the inner actor instead of the role we play. And she describes the different stages of this transformation, starting at first with the selfish person, who, following his animal-like tendencies, is completely focused on himself, not caring about others, but only his own pleasure and well-being. But when this person marries, and has children, for instance, his range already expands to his family for whom he develops compassion. And taking it one step further, this range extends to his friends and relations, for whom he feels sympathy, always willing to give a helping hand when needed. And next, Blavatsky describes a patriot, one who identifies with his country, willing to fight for it, extending his circle to the country's borders, but not yet realizing his connection with inhabitants of other countries. But so far, Blavatsky explains this expansion of consciousness that is taking place is still at the level of the outer man, because there is still an element of personal affection in it, asserting a form of separateness, of identifying with a group, however large, but which still doesn't include all of humanity. It's still the outer man who identifies with the outer form of a group, and that is where the great danger lies. Because when such a person becomes a fanatic, and out of this fanaticism dedicates himself to his country or his faith, this becomes the very breeding ground for misery, of fighting against the other that is not his. But then Blavatsky continues, and I quote, "Ascending, however, in the scale of manhood, we come to those who shadow forth the latent God in man in thoughts, words, and deeds of divine self-sacrifice. The prerogative of their Godhead first manifesting in acts of real charity, in pity of their suffering fellowkind, or from an intuitional feeling of duty, the first heralding of accession to divine responsibility and the realization of the unity of all souls." In other words, not the outer form, but the inner side of all life, the unity of all souls, the immortal consciousness behind whatever external form. And that is true compassion, without bias, without being selective, but universal, encompassing all life. And the very moment you make this choice to dedicate yourself to humanity from this sense of unity, something will happen within yourself. Then, as mentioned before, this divine light begins to shine in you, causing an acceleration of the development of your inner abilities, enabling you to be significantly relevant and meaningful. And this expresses itself in two ways. On the one hand, this development of consciousness leads to a growing wisdom, a deeper understanding, which enables you to see more clearly how to be helpful to others, what your function is in life, and which is the medicine against the existential crisis we mentioned before. And on the other hand, this expanding consciousness also leads to an increasing range, a growing circle of influence, with the corresponding increasing number of people you can help. And this is thus a gradual process of development, in which everyone takes their own unique place. And where we find ourselves on this path actually doesn't matter at all, as long as the intention is from the heart, to act and live for the well-being of the whole, without expecting anything in return. That is what really matters. By always asking yourself in the choices we make in life, what is in the best interest of the greater good? And of course, we should not exaggerate this, but see what we can do gradually and steadily progressing, trying to do a little better each time. And the actual strength to persevere lies in the realization that compassion, as has become clear tonight, is not a fake wish, not some unachievable ideal, not just a nice quality that some have and others don't, but that it is our deepest essence, a divine state of consciousness, which we are learning to express more and more. Therefore, compassion as a universal way of living is in fact the most natural thing there is. It is the development of inner strength that is being released when we forget ourselves in the service of the well-being of the totality. An inner strength that transcends all personal challenges and limitations, and of which the reward, as Blavatsky said, is beyond all description, namely the power to bless and save humanity. Okay, we will now have a short break of 3 minutes, after which there is some time for questions, and then we can enter our study. So see you in a minute. Jenny, do we have any questions for this part?
Yes, we have one question. First of all, that person want to thank very much for the deep and inspiring lecture. And
We will pass it on to Vragen. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. And he says, to awaken compassion in our fellow men, the best way seems to be the own example. But are there other useful ways or methods?
Well, I guess if I guess the questioner has listened very well, because you can always, of course, study things, try to get more, find more ways, more wisdom, but it's only really how do you say, it's only really useful and part of you when you are already a living example of that wisdom. So it's always, I guess, the power of the being the example that is the big difference. So I think, and of course that implies this motive, because that is actually the main thing. So, and if the motive is right, if you are compassionate, then you will always try to live up to what you know is best for the totality. So, so I think that's really the one and only way. But maybe Jenny, you have other insights.
No, I think it's true.
Yeah.
And yeah, indeed, what you said, the unity of everything to explore that and to have a more broader and broader vision, what you also talked about in the lecture, that helps to be compassionate.
Yeah.
I think that's another method.
Yeah, I think because that's also what Bauke presented. The uh, we had he had three parts in his lecture, and the third part is really about practice. It's just you have to bring it into practice, and if you do that from the right motive, that's the best you can do always. Yeah.
Nice. Okay, thank you. That were all the questions.
Okay, then we'll just wait for the signal to start with our study. All right. Then we will end with Gayatri. O thou golden sun of most excellent splendor, illumine our hearts and fill our minds, so that we, recognizing our oneness with the divinity, which is the heart of the universe, may see the pathway before our feet and tread it to those distant goals of perfection, stimulated by thine own radiant light.